talk title today is Properly Valuing Treatments for Rare Diseases. Your title for the session today is Rewriting the Rules or Rethinking Cost Effectiveness for Rare Diseases. And first thing I'm going to do is I want to edit that by saying it's not cost effectiveness, but rethinking the valuation for rare diseases. And I draw that distinction because cost effectiveness analysis cannot really consider at all the consequences of severity of illness or disability. And most rare diseases have high severity or disability or both. And because of that, we need a new way of thinking about rare diseases, I will suggest to you. And I'm going to propose that we use the Generalized Risk-Adjusted Cost-Effectiveness Model. GRACE is the acronym. That comes from my co-author, Darius Lakdawala at USC. I call it a graceful way of thinking. After a couple of glasses of wine, sometimes I say amazing grace, but I will be referring to it as GRACE before. But I will also say that even the GRACE model is insufficient to think about the value of rare diseases and treating them. And I'm going to introduce the concept of social welfare functions and a specific form of that will provide a broader way of thinking about the value of rare diseases. So I want to begin by the question: why do we need cost-effectiveness analysis? And what does it do? And of course, beginning with that, the answer is for most market goods and services, free markets as we have in the U.S. and Canada, of course, consumers make their own choices about what they want to buy. And importantly, they make these choices subject to the constraints of their budget. In healthcare, however, health insurance breaks the connection between value that we place on something and the costs we have to pay for it. And so cost effectiveness analysis, in a sense, provides a way to reintroduce cost into a measure of value. And that cost effectiveness measure is based upon a single, fully informed, rational decision maker. I'm going to emphasize it's a single person, and that's going to be important as we come up later. But I also now want to raise the question: what happens if the model of value that's embedded in the cost effectiveness analysis doesn't really reflect consumers' true preferences? How do we get consumers' real value structures into it? Now, there's some well-known problems with cost effectiveness analysis. We know that it fails to match a lot of value measures of value. People value treatment of more severe illnesses more heavily. We know that. We also know that cost effectiveness discriminates against disabled people, and that's primarily important in the signals that it sends to developers of new pharmaceuticals and similar technologies. In fact, it's so much that the Affordable Care Act in the U.S. has banned the use of cost effectiveness in making governmental decisions. And to many, it appears to be missing a lot of sources of value. Now, with that, I'm going to come back into a very basic question, which leads me to my discussion of GRACE in this. What is economics? And it's basically the relationship. More simply, economics is a study of scarcity. And I focus on that because it's the fundamental problem. Cost effectiveness analysis methodology does not recognize scarcity. Alan Williams, one of the major figures in the early development, said equality is equality is equality. No matter whether the person who receives it is disabled, the health gain, or the illness of that person is mild or severe, if the person is young or old, or for today's topic, whether the person's disease is common or rare. And cost effectiveness cannot deal with any of those. So we'll now like to introduce a new alternative to this. I am one of the co-authors of it, the GRACE model, and I think it quite dramatically alters the way of thinking about how to value health gains. It introduces scarcity and satiation in health, and that leads to the following major insights that diverge from cost effectiveness analysis. First, it says that it increases the value of treating people with disabilities, unambiguously. It says it increases the value of treating high severity diseases, but in parallel, it also says that we're probably overvaluing the treatment of minor illnesses. And so that's a combination of events that throws the cost effectiveness out of kilter, because it's not really at this point thinking about the disease severity. It's treating all the same. And this is especially true when we're thinking about rare diseases, because they commonly involve, as I've noted, high disability and acute illness severity, very commonly. I'm not going to read the bibliography, but this is the work that Darius Lakdawala and I have published together since 2020. The most recent of them, at the bottom, the 3 pillars for the support for orphan drug programs. Fortuitously, we've just published this when I was asked to come and speak here, so that's what I'm talking about today. So now a shameless promotion. This is the book that Darius and I published late last year with Oxford University Press. The link at the bottom will take you right to the page where you can buy a hardback copy. And with all of this, I'm going to ask quite simply, does cost effectiveness have any remaining life given all the difficulties that I think at least, that it presents? And I think you understand from that picture what my answer is to the question. Now, how did I get to this point of doing grace? I think it began, and this is one of those wonderful things where being at the meeting mattered a lot. I was on the task force that was created by ISPOR, the International Health Economics Association, in 2017 to define an economics-based approach to valuing gains in health. That was the task of the group. And they identified what is now the famous or infamous value flower, your choice, of potential elements of value, all of each of the petals in this, and the one circled up at the upper right, qualities in cost and productivity, are the only ones of these that are captured by standard cost effectiveness. And that left all of this other array of things, but the value flower in the task force's work identified these missing elements of potential value, but it doesn't tell you how to measure them properly and to avoid double counting, and there's a lot of risk of that. So what came next is, at that meeting in person, I met for the first time Darius Lakdawala, my co-author in all of this, and I will just say right now, any errors that we find in this are Darius's fault. No. He's a very, very smart dude, I will just say. Darius and I teamed up to try and find a way to combine those missing elements in the value flower into a single unified system, and we developed the GRACE model from that. And it captures almost all of the remaining elements of the value flower into a single coherent economic model. It's missing equity and scientific spillovers. I'll come back to equity in just a moment. And to my astonishment, when I finally look back at all the way GRACE has developed through the years I've worked with Darius, they all arise from the single change from cost effectiveness models, and that is, it recognizes scarcity and satiation instead of assuming that there are constant returns to health and gaining and creating value. Now, I'm going to discuss equity as well, one of the other missing elements subsequently in my talk, using a different tool. So the first steps towards understanding the GRACE model, I want to talk a little about how willingness to pay for health gains is measured. The standard model of this is defined, first of all, I'm going to just define the consumption in various countries of reference here. That's income minus medical spending. And there's a big difference between consumption and income. In Canada, consumption is about 88% of your gross per capita domestic product. The remaining 12% is spent on healthcare. In the US, it's only 81% because we're very profligate and we spend 19% of our GDP on healthcare, which is an astonishing factoid. And in the UK, it's very similar to what it is here. And the willingness to pay that I'm going to come back to over and over again is fundamentally reflects the way people want to make trade-offs between their consumption and health. Because as they pay for things to improve their health, they're giving up consumption. Consumption is the opportunity cost of improved health. And we should expect that this exchange rate, the trade-off rate that people are willing to do, is going to differ depending on how sick you are. And finally, that to make cost effectiveness useful for decision making, the decision makers must finally pick a maximum willingness to pay for healthcare gains. I'll come to a little more detail on that in just a moment. You can't use cost effectiveness analysis without doing that to make it useful. So you have to pick a decision threshold that says this is the most we're going to pay for a gain in health. And that in the United States, the ICER, the organization, uses $100 to $150,000 as a willingness to pay range, and they have a fudge factor for rare diseases for up to $200,000 per quality adjusted life year. And so the multiplier, and I want to kind of pay attention to this a little bit, the multiplier of willingness to pay to per capita gross domestic product is about 1.25 to 1.75. That is to say, we're willing to pay more than a year's worth of personal consumption income in order to gain health. And some people in the U.S. are arguing for even much larger values, 150 to 200,000 or more per quality. In the United Kingdom, quite in contrast, the threshold is 30,000 pounds. That's about 40,000 US dollars. Per capita GDP is about 37,000. So their multiplier is about 0.8. That is to say, their cutoff in threshold in decision making is only 80% of the year's worth of per capita GDP. And quite in contrast to the US, where the multiplier is about 1.5 on average. And then in Canada, the threshold at least informally in decision making is 50,000 Canadian dollars, which is about 40,000 in US now at the exchange rate. So per capita income is about 55,000. So your multiplier is about 0.9. So you see this range of multipliers, 0.8 in UK, 0.9 here, and about 1.5 in the US. Now, what's going on in this is the willingness to pay. This value that I've just been talking about is really defined by the trade-off between consumption and health. And sorry, there's a little bit of math involved in this, but the blue curve here in this picture represents the combinations of consumption and health that create the same level of happiness, utility. Economists call it an indifference curve, or just indifferent between any combination of health and consumption along that. And that's the basic trade-off. But you'll notice that as we start into that, the slope on that, the little red horizontal, almost horizontal at the bottom, is the trade-off rate at that particular point. That's the tangent to the curve. And that slope is, in fact, the marginal rate of substitution. That is the willingness to pay for a perfect year in health, a year in perfect health, excuse me. And that slope gets steeper and steeper as health declined, as you see in these red bars that just keep, as you move to weaker and weaker health and moving to the left in this diagram, the slope gets steeper, willingness to pay is growing as health shrinks. And that's the fundamental message of GRACE that cost effectiveness analysis ignores, is the willingness to pay changes with severity. And that's the reason for it. And the marginal rate of substitution, the slope here is the willingness to pay for health. That's the opportunity cost as you gain health by giving up consumption. Now, cost effectiveness imposes a fairly important restriction on consumers' utility of health. I'm going to begin by showing you a very general functional form, which makes it simpler to describe this. But economists think in terms of utility function. So I'm going to have a utility function of value that is made better by consumption or health, C or H. And to make it simple, I'm going to use this multiplicative form where there's utility function U of C for consumption, and then a multiplier of W of H, the utility function for health. And the utility function for consumption in all of these models has diminishing returns, so that you get this bowing curvature in the picture of graphing utility versus consumption. That's what diminishing returns looks like. And that's true at all levels of health, whether you're in perfect health at H equals 1 or in some lower level of health, you always have these diminishing returns. Now, in contrast, in cost effectiveness analysis, the trade-off rate is linear. It's the red line in this lower diagram that shows that there's constant returns, and that's what the model of cost effectiveness analysis does. So the willingness to pay is the same for all levels of health. And in fact, the correct approach is the blue line that says we're going to allow for diminishing returns as well. That's the fundamental difference between GRACE and the previous models of cost effectiveness. And that's exactly what Grace does. It allows for that diminishing returns. So to do this, I'm going to, again, use this simple value formula where I break apart the utility function into the two multipliers. That simplifies the math, but it's not fundamental for the overall value. I apologize to those that are not fully trained in economics here, but I want to touch on briefly for those who are. This utility function creates these margin utilities where the margin utility of consumption depends on the level of health, W of H, the utility of it, and similarly, the margin utility of health depends on the level of consumption. So they interact in this very specific way in this model. And the ratio of those two slopes is the marginal rate of substitution. It's the ratio of the incremental gain that you get from a little bit of health or a little bit of consumption. I apologize for the math here for those who are not into this, but that's the formula I just described to you. And if I define a new variable as the proportional change in utility as consumption changes, it's called I call it omega, to a subset of C for consumption, and with positive but diminishing returns, that proportional change is going to be somewhere between 0 and 1. That is, it grows but at a diminishing rate. And if we define a similar thing for the utility of health, then you get the same thing. You get a consumption elasticity that is somewhere between 0 and 1. And using those, we can redefine the marginal rate of substitution as consumption, the level of consumption you have, the dollar value of it, divided by health in the perfect state. That's equal to 1, actually, in the normal model. And then the ratio of these two proportional rates of change. So you can see here that the marginal rate of substitution is really going to hinge on how fast utility is changing in health as health changes, divided by how fast utility of consumption is changing as consumption changes. And in the cost effectiveness model, this is what Alan Garber and I proved in our 1997 article. The willingness to pay, which I'm going to call K, is equal to the same thing, except it has 1 in the numerator instead of that elasticity for health. And that is the cost effectiveness threshold in the decision model. Alan Garber, my co-author, by the way, is now the president of Harvard University and is busy doing battle with the Trump administration over funding of universities. Strength to your arm, Alan. So in the proper marginal rate of substitution, you want to put that elasticity of consumption back into the numerator of this value. So your Grace replaces the 1 in the numerator, that willingness to pay, with this elasticity of health. And of course, it has somewhere between 0 and 1 as the value. So that at that point, you can now see the first point I made, and that is without doing anything else, since that omega H value is somewhere between 0 and 1, the Grace value for willingness to pay, or the value of a intervention, is going to be smaller in Grace than it is in cost effectiveness, unless you make a correction for severity or disability. And so that means we're undertreating, that means we're overtreating, overvaluing treatments for minimally severe disorders. That's a surprise to some people who think that this is a shill for pharmaceutical companies, but in fact, value goes down in Grace for minor illnesses. Now, there is a correction that's built into Grace for severity of illness. And it's based on the fact, again, that you have diminishing returns. So if you start out with the marginal utility of health, the slope of the blue line at the upper part at perfect health, H naught, you see that slope is fairly flat, the slope is small, and then as you get to more and more severe health, as you move to the left of the H sub S, the sick level, you see that slope increases, and the correction in Grace for the severity is the ratio of those two marginal utilities. That's just straight out what's happening there. And for those of you who are not into the math that I just ran through, again, I apologize for that. All you have to remember is that Grace builds in a multiplier R, and it's bigger than 1, and it rises exponentially as illness severity increases. That's all you need to remember. Now, there's a similar change adjustment for pre-existing disability. Net correction is mathematically slightly different. It's the ratio of the utilities in perfect health to the utility in the disabled state. This arises because in the disabled state, the utility of consumption is lower, so the foregone utility is smaller, and you're willing to pay more for health. And again, all you have to remember in this is that there is a multiplier in grace. We call it D. It's equal to 1 or more. 1 only in perfect health. And again, that multiplier rises exponentially as disability severity increases. So that's all you need to, that's the take-home message about this. And so now I'm going to assemble these things back into position. Here's the willingness to pay is defined in cost effectiveness analysis. That's from Garber and Phelps. And then the first thing that Grace does is to build in this correction that says we're going to drop down the value because of the diminishing returns to H. That is, omega H is between 0 and 1, but not equal to 1. And then it corrects again for multiplying it by the illness severity multiplier, which is bigger, at least 1, and rising with illness severity, and another multiplier for disability. So that's how Grace changes the willingness to pay. First of all, it takes off a notch because of the diminishing returns to health, and then it builds it back up if you have a severe untreated illness severity and if you have a pre-existing disability. And it turns out those are multiplicative multipliers. And the thing that just astonishes me as I look back on this, every one of these adjustments that come out of the Grace model compared to the cost effectiveness is because the marginal rate of substitution is built in, and instead of being constant as in cost effectiveness, we allow it to be diminishing returns to health. And that is the only single thing that changes. Now, to kind of summarize, I want to develop for you what I call the total value of a medical intervention. The TV. Anyway, if we talk about the average gain in health-related quality of life as mu B, let's say for benefit, the average gain, and mu sub P is the average gain in survival probability, and H bar is the average level of health in the treated state. Cost effectiveness says that the value of a medical intervention is the willingness to pay value K, and then you have the gain in survival probability weighted by the average quality in that survival period. And then you also get the gains in health-related quality of life and mu B, and those extend over the life expectancy of the person. That in a single simple period one, well, that's the value. And in contrast for that, the Grace value for the same medical intervention, it throws in those three things I've just talked about. There's a multiplier D for disability at the front end that rises exponentially with pre-existing disability. We replace the average value of health with this other exchange rate, rho H naught. I'm not going to tinker around with that today. It's not pertinent to the rare disease. And we also add in the two things, lower value because of diminishing returns, and then higher value in R for increasing severity. So that's how the value of a medical intervention changes in Grace compared to cost effectiveness. Now, for all of you math freaks out there, there is a multi-period model for this. Grace treats cost the same as standard cost effectiveness. We use the same discounting approach. So it's basically adding up the same, except you've got in these parameters for values that are all thrown in. And all these value adjustments, R and D for severity and disability, and this exchange rate rho vary with time. So to implement Grace, and I know this question will likely come up later, you need to have a utility function in health. That's the one thing that we need, is to get an estimate of the parameters for that. For example, in a really simple example, if that utility function says that the utility is H raised to the power gamma, and gamma between 0 and 1, then that's the utility function. For example, it could be utility is the square root of health, and you see the diminishing returns built in that. But once you know that value of gamma in this particular function, you know everything you need to do Grace. You've got all the utility function parameters you need to make the adjustments. And fortunately, There now exists at least one measure of those preferences in the article coming out in Journal of Health Economics late last year. Karen Mulligan and others, including Darius and myself in this. Now, this is for a representative U.S. population only, not Canadian. We might talk about that in the question and answer about how applicable that is. So given all these complications, all the messy math that's in the multi-period model and the necessity to have an estimate of the function, you don't need to estimate the parameters of the utility function for each new intervention measure, for each new health technology assessment. That can be done once, and you can use those parameters forever. So in fact, the difference between using cost effectiveness and GRACE is just the bookkeeping is a little more complicated. But I'll tell you, I can do it. I can write that all in an Excel spreadsheet program. And folks, you do not want to hire me as an Excel programmer. But it's that simple. It really is. It's not complicated. So as a summary of the difference between GRACE and others, how cost effectiveness cannot incorporate illness or pre-existing disability because it does not allow for diminishing returns. So you have these three adjustments in GRACE that I've talked about for severity, disability, and diminishing returns. So with that summary, I'm now going to shift gears completely. I promised to you earlier that I would come back and talk about the equity concerns that are one of the remaining petals, and GRACE cannot deal with that on its own, because GRACE, just like cost effectiveness, is based on the preference of a single rational decision maker. And you can't think fully about rare diseases that involve population probabilities when you're thinking about things from the perspective of a single individual. So that's to fully understand the rare disease value. I think we're going to have to build in a way to do a societal perspective, so I conclude that GRACE is a necessary component to get the values of individuals right, but it's insufficient. It's not going to get you to the full value. So how to get there? I'm going to build up by using social welfare functions. And this is a way of assembling individual value preferences into a measure of value for everybody in the population. And I'm going to begin with the model that John Harsanyi did, who was a Nobel Prize winner in economics in 1994, not for this work, but for something that's quite closely related. His was in game theory. And I'm going to begin with his social welfare function, and I'm going to build the measure of GRACE values into it. And then I'm going to introduce the concept of horizontal equity to you and show you how that affects the value function. So Harsanyi's proof, and I think this is just an astonishing proof. If you begin with two basic presumptions, then you get down to a very, very specific single model of value. And the two assumptions are: one, there's uncertainty that's present. Yes, do we have uncertainty in healthcare, health economics, or health outcomes? Yes, we do. And the second is, if you accept the belief that individuals, so that begins to build. Now, what that means is we're not going to include how much I value your gains in health. We're going to use your measures of how much you value gains in health in the social welfare function, not my measures of how much you value it. That's what that means. And that means the social welfare function then is simply adding up the expected utility of individuals, that's everything inside the square brackets, weighted by what I call theta sub n. Theta is the societal weight for the person numbers 1 to n in your population. And these weights do not come from economic theory, period. They are either political or ethical choices. And trust me, I do not mean to presume that politicians are ethical as I say that. But this model distinguishes carefully between what economists can bring to the table in adding to this value measure and what we cannot do as in economics. And these utility weights, the thetas, have to come through a political process. So beginning with that simple model and using the GRACE model, and I'm going to use a very simple one-period model to do this, begin with that social welfare function that I just described, that Harsanyi says is the only legitimate social welfare function. It's quite an amazing proof. And then I can ask, how does that social welfare function change, the second line in this slide, if you change health, the delta sub H, delta H's, and change consumption, the delta C's. And that simply adds it all up. You get the value of the incremental marginal utility of health times the change in health plus the marginal utility of consumption times the change consumption. And then you add them up and you weight them all by the theta weight for each individual. And to really keep this simple, let's just say the consumption is not going to change for anybody. That'll focus on the health gains. And now we have this very simple social welfare function that says we're going to add up for all the people in the society, that's the summation, weighted by theta, the political weighting, the political weight, the expected utility of consumption, and marginal utility of health times the change in health. That's that UCN times W prime, that's the marginal utility of health in the Grace model. And this has this, unfortunately, has this disturbing conclusion that it's more valuable to treat, to improve the health of people who are wealthy, because you see the utility of C is higher for wealthier persons, and the social welfare function says, oh, we're going to add them up and we're going to give higher weight to improving the health of people that are wealthier. That's a real problem. So the health economists normally fix that by assuming that everybody in the society has the same level of consumption. So we'll put in the average level C bar here, and then we can arbitrarily set that to utility of average consumption as 1. And now we have this very simple utility function, even simpler. We can simplify this further as we come along here, that the social welfare is in change, and we can measure that by adding up the changes weighted by the theta social welfare function weight of the changes in health, the delta H's, multiplying the marginal utilities of health. And there is that very simple utility function, and it's the marginal utility of health that's in there, and that's going to change as the health level changes. Now, in one final step here, we can monetize this. For example, if you divide the utility of consumption, economists talk about utility and its measure of value as the util. How many of you have actually seen a util? See a lot of hands up in there. So we want to monetize that, and we do that by dividing through by the marginal utility of health. And when it turns out when you do that, you get a dollar measure of value in dollars or yen or pounds or euros, whatever the right value. And we can monetize gains in health again by using this K value, the willingness to pay for a year in perfect health. And so we can now monetize, so we now have the monetized change in social welfare arising from changes in health. That's what this formula says. And we're going to take the value per change in health, K, and we're going to multiply it by the social welfare function values theta, and then the marginal utility of health and the changes in health for each person. We're going to add up all those changes in utility, and that'll give us the dollar value of the social welfare function. And it's going to use this value K as a starting point. So now I'm positioned to come in and squeeze in the article that Dryas and I published at the end of last year, the 3 pillars of support for orphan drug programs. Okay. So first, let's begin with saying, what does that social welfare function look like if you have cost-effectiveness analysis as the basic model of value? And it does that by saying the changes in marginal value of health, the changes are not the marginal utility of health, which is constant, but just simply the changes in health. So it's K, the multiplier, multiplied by, and then you add up all the changes in health for everybody in the society, multiplied by the societal weight. And that's the simplest of all welfare functions, social welfare functions in the Hersonian model. And NICE in Europe, in the UK, does it simply by saying that everybody has the same societal weight. Now, Grace introduces some adjustments that reflect scarcity into that. So instead of the CEA model, we're going to incorporate the multiplier that says we're going to have diminished value because for rare diseases or diminishing returns, and their severity and multipliers and disability multipliers, and these are subscripted for each person N in the population. So now we're going to add up the gains in health, and the marginal utility of those is going to reflect the disability multiplier and the severity of illness multipliers. That's the social welfare function change monetized in GRACE. And again, there we have the marginal utility there. So GRACE properly incorporates people's real value preferences, and we can estimate those as the paper that I just showed you. We can estimate those preference functions using a whole variety of different methods. So it's fundamentally important when valuing rare diseases that you bring in this model that captures people's preferences, that it's more valuable. It's more valuable to me treat an illness when I'm really sick or if I'm disabled. And that's what this model does. Now, the second pillar in horizontal equity, second pillar of support for rare diseases is what I'm going to call horizontal equity. Now, horizontal equity simply says that as an ethical principle, people who are in similar circumstances should be treated similarly. How many of you in the room think that's a good idea? People in similar circumstances should be treated similarly. Raise your hand if you think that's a good idea. Yeah. Okay, that is the concept of horizontal equity. And now what happens is if we now develop a social welfare function that includes the probability of diseases in our social welfare function, and we have rare diseases, that probability of the rare disease now seeks into the expected utility function, and the probability function pi is going to be smaller for people with rare diseases. So until we make some adjustment of the social welfare function, it's going to say that it's less valuable to treat people with rare diseases. You got that? That's the unfortunate conclusion unless we bring in horizontal equity. So to fix that problem, and this is something I want you to carry home with as you go about talking about the value of treating rare diseases to your colleagues and friends in your professional situation. Horizontal equity requires that people with the same disease or disability should be treated equally, independent of disease probability. And so you go back to the social welfare function, we're going to fix this flaw in it, or in conclusion of it, by introducing a societal weight. I'll call it psi. It's another Greek letter with theta, and it's going to vary by disease. So we're going to be capital T different diseases in our population, and horizontal equity requires that the societal weight for treating the rare people with that disease is going to be inverse to the probability. And once you do that, you now come up to the social welfare function. You've now multiplied the societal social welfare function with the rare disease probability pi offset by the social welfare function psi, and you're back to the social welfare function that cancels out the effects of rare diseases. So horizontal equity brings you back to the conclusion that everybody should be added up equally, but in this case, independent of the probability of disease. And so you get to the point of saying it's just as valuable to treat people with the same condition, the same severity or the same disability. It's just as valuable in society to treat them independent of the rarity if you have this horizontal equity presumption that people in similar circumstances should be treated similarly. And I think that concept of horizontal equity offers a very strong point of explanation of why almost every developed society in the modern world has orphan drug programs. They're saying, in effect, we think it's more important to treat rare diseases than it is to treat the diseases that are not so rare. And we're going to give it extra bonus in various different ways for finding ways to improve people who have these rare diseases. Now, there are limits to this horizontal equity concept that I just described to you. It's not costless. Obviously, if you say we're going to do this to carry it out to the very extreme circumstance, the rarest of rare diseases that are known to humans right now, there's 3 people in the world that have it. 2 identical twins and Welsh twins, and one other person that's been identified with this. You were not going to find a drug to treat a disease that only affects 3 people. There are limits to this. And so we're going to have to find some way to decide how much are we willing to pay in society to improve horizontal equity. I do not have the answer to that question yet. I hope somebody in this room develops the answer to that question. How should we do that? There are some possible approaches to doing it. determined what inequality can, level can be inequality reduction can be funded by some increase in budget, and just keep going until you say, I don't want to increase the budgets anymore. Or you can, other ways, the Atkinson's inequality index can be developed in this. I'm not going to dive into these things. Now, in real world adjustments to these utility for orphan drug programs, none of them actually approach this concept of perfect horizontal equity. So in fact, what happens is all these programs has some threshold that says a disease is rare or it's not rare. And these thresholds differ a lot in Canada and UK, EU, and it's 1 in 2,000 people. It's 200,000 cases, which is about 1 in 1,650 people. So it's a little more generous. And Japan has 1 in 50,000, which is a very generous rule. So they're a much more inclusive measure for rare diseases than the US or UK or most of the other nations in the world. But it's this threshold that's either yes or no, and it does not take into account fully the horizontal equity concept. So one of the things I would hope to do is we find ways to get people to think about a broader interpretation of rarity and something more than this yes or no implication of rare diseases. There's more of this on the paper that Darius and I and another colleague wrote. So in summary, the concepts for evaluating rare diseases, societal welfare functions are necessary to fully understand the value of treating rare diseases. You can't do it on grace or cost effectiveness alone. The second implication is this, of course, is the proper social welfare functions. This is Harsanyi's work, fully incorporate individuals' own values, which bring in severity and disability in the GRACE model. And that's the way you have to do that. To get it properly, you have to use GRACE. And without horizontal equity, you don't have any special value for treating rare diseases. So you got to bring in horizontal equity into a societal social welfare function to really capture the full value. And that horizontal requires these new societal weights. And as I said, no nation does that fully at this point. So the third pillar is anonymous altruism. I will not dive into this today. If you want to find out about anonymous altruism, go read this paper that was published in late last year, December, in Value and Health, ISPOR's flagship journal. And if you don't know about ISPOR, I urge you strongly to get involved with it. It's a wonderful organization. So that's the third pillar in the Value and Health. And it's in this theme section that Brian Rittenhouse added in late December. So I'm now going to summarize my summaries, and that is the full value of treating rare diseases can only be explained by using social welfare functions. To capture this correctly, they have to use GRACE to capture rarity and disability, the implications of diminishing marginal utility, and they have to introduce the concept of horizontal equity. People in similar situations should be treated similarly. So, with that, I will leave you your action items to rewrite the rules, which is what your conference intends to do today. The first is, in order to get this right, you're going to have to get people to think about using social welfare functions and not just cost effectiveness analysis alone. That's your missionary job, to introduce that concept into the discussion. You can't rely on cost effectiveness or GRACE alone, and you have to use GRACE in that to measure value properly for individuals, and the horizontal equity has to be introduced in that model. And to do that, if you're going to go about thinking about ways to rewrite the rules in Canada or in Alberta, I think you're going to have to begin to introduce this concept of social welfare functions, and specifically the concept of horizontal equity. And that I come a little later to questions, but right now I'm all ears. Thank you very much.